getElementById is one very convenient and good way of getting access to an element by a unique identifier, by its ID. But it's not the only way of getting access to an element. An alternative is another utility function which you have built into JavaScript. And that's the querySelector method, which is also part of this document object. So you see this document object is rather important. Just like getElementById, this is a method, so we execute it like this with parentheses. But unlike ID, this does not want an ID as a parameter, but instead it wants a CSS selector. So as we would have used it in CSS code. As a string, but then any selector of our choice. So we can use a tag selector here, a class selector, or an ID selector. So I could also select this element by ID by writing this appropriate CSS ID selector, which is hash symbol external-ID. That's how we would select an element by ID in CSS, and that's the kind of parameter value querySelector wants. And now this will look for an element like this. So here I then also again get my anchor element. And then here I can change this to yet another address, for example, to our own homepage, academine.com. Now, this is an alternative to getElementById. And when you have alternatives, the obvious question is always which alternative or which approach is better. Now, the short answer is there is no better or worse approach. You can use either of the two. But there is a key difference, actually. getElementById, as the name suggests, is really focused on getting elements by ID. So it's a great way of getting a specific element if you added an ID to it in your HTML code, which you as the developer can of course always do. querySelector, on the other hand, wants any CSS selector. It doesn't have to be the ID selector. So here I could alternatively also select my anchor tag by not using the ID here, but the A CSS selector, the type selector. So selecting by HTML type. Just as we can write CSS rules like this, where we then, for example, change the color of all anchor elements. That's what we can do in CSS, and that's what we can do with querySelector. And this will then select the first anchor element it finds on your page. If you have multiple anchor elements in different places of your HTML code, querySelector will always give you the first element that matches this selector condition. But it's the extra flexibility compared to getElementById that could be useful. You can also have more complex selectors in here, like PA. So selecting the first anchor you as the developer can of course always do. querySelector, on the other hand, wants any CSS selector. It doesn't have to be the ID selector. So here I could alternatively also select my anchor tag by not using the ID here, but the A CSS selector, the type selector. So selecting by HTML type. Just as we can write CSS rules like this, where we then, for example, change the color of all anchor elements. That's what we can do in CSS, and that's what we can do with query selector. And this will then select the first anchor element it finds on your page. If you have multiple anchor elements in different places of your HTML code, query selector will always give you the first element that matches this selector condition. But it's the extra flexibility compared to get element by ID that could be useful. You can also have more complex selectors in here, like PA. So selecting the first anchor element that sits inside of a paragraph. Just what you can do in CSS as well. Selecting anchor elements in paragraphs, that's how you can do it here, with the important difference that this will always select the first matching element, not all matching elements. If you want to match all elements, then you have query selector all. This will then not return a single element, but all matching elements. So it will return an array instead of a single object. Here I want a single element, so query selector is what I want to use here. And for the moment, that's it. It already was a lot of new knowledge with the drilling we can do with those different utility functions, but these are core mechanisms of selecting content of your page and of working with JavaScript and the DOM. I can only encourage you that you do play around with this console here in the DevTools to find out what's inside the body here, to drill into this body and use console dir to get that object view here, so to say, where you can really find out which properties you have in there and how you could use these properties to navigate around between elements or to access or change their content. Play around with that, because we'll do that a lot throughout the course, but it definitely also won't hurt if you play around a little bit with that first.
When it comes to querying, selecting HTML and JavaScript, there are a couple of common methods that are worth knowing. The HTML element by its ID. Selects the first matching HTML element that is the selected by the provided CSS selector. The CSS selector can basically be any kind of valid CSS selector. And you type tag type selector, type class selector. Select all matching HTML elements. There are also a few lesser used methods that you also should implement. Select all HTML elements that
We learned how we can select elements, and it can definitely be tricky to get that right. That's why it's super important to practice it. I told you to play around with it a little bit on your own so that you get more familiar with the different ways of selecting elements. Now it's time to practice this together. It's exercise time. And attached, you'll find this exercise.js file
Oh.
which contains some tasks for you to practice what you learned. Now in task number 1, I want you to select the h1 element, which we have in our HTML code, by drilling into the DOM. So not with getElementById or query selector, but by diving into the properties of some other objects as you saw it in the last lectures. It's up to you which specific way you choose. There will be more than one way of getting access to this element, but once you got hold of it, you should save it in a variable with a name of your choice. That's task number 1. In task number 2, I want you to use that variable from 1, and then do something which we haven't done before, but which you should be able to do nonetheless. Get access to the parent element of that stored h1 element, which is stored in that variable. And for that, you of course might want to console.dir that variable which you created here, so that you see which properties are available on it, and maybe you find some property that gives you access to the parent HTML element, so to the body element, since that is the parent of this h1 element. Now, there also is a bonus task. You can even extend this a bit further and also get access to the sibling element of h1. So to this paragraph which we have here, this paragraph is a sibling of h1, it sits on the same level, and maybe, that's a little bonus, you even find a way of getting access to that. Now you don't need to store the body or this sibling element in any variable, just getting access to it.
I'm gonna have to come back to this.